Hey guys, welcome back to Homebrew Wednesdays. This is number 7 for me. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about yeast and the difference between rehydrating your yeast and making a yeast starter. But first, what I have here is the Mexican cerveza. I told you guys I was brewing a few episodes back. I put it in my kegs last night, got it down really cold and carbonated it this morning. So let's give it a taste. It's very hoppy. It's very, very hoppy. This is your standard kit and kilo. I make it the way I always make it. I used a can of Cooper's Mexican cerveza hop malt extract. I used 1 pound of light dry malt extract, 2 pounds of dextrose or corn sugar. But this time I decided to make a hop tea with it. I took an ounce of Autumn hops and I boiled them in water for 8 minutes. Used that to mix all the ingredients together, and then I threw 2 ounces of Autumn hops into the fermenting bucket as kind of a secondary or like a dry hop, and it turned out really good. I think it's actually kind of like a generic IPA, and you can really taste the hops. They're sitting right on top of the malt flavor. But okay, so everybody involved with home brewing knows about yeast. Without yeast, well, it wouldn't be home brewing. Excuse me. But there's different things that you can do with the yeast. You can sprinkle the yeast on top and stir it in. You can sprinkle the yeast on top and not stir it in. You can rehydrate your yeast. And a couple of different ways you can do that. The instructions on most packets just say to sprinkle in a cup of warm water, about 4 ounces. Warm being 100 to 104 degrees. Cover it with some cellophane and let it sit for 15 minutes. And that works. I do a method like that when I do my wines, except instead of just plain water or water and sugar, I actually use the wine must that I just made. I take a cup of the wine out of the bucket, or the must, sorry. I take a cup of that out of the bucket. I warm it up. Once it hits 100 degrees, I sprinkle my wine or champagne yeast, which I've allowed to sit out on the table for an hour or so to bring it up to room temperature since it's refrigerated. I sprinkle that on top and then I leave it sit for 20 minutes. Now the idea behind that is the yeast is going to wake up in the solution, or in the exact solution that it's going to be fermenting. So it's going to wake up the sugars, and the type of sugars that are in the solution is the exact same thing that's in the larger bucket that you just made. And I think doing it that way works a lot better than, you know, just waking it up in water. Now, for yeast starters, so anyway, that's how I rehydrate my yeast for wine. When I make beers, especially extract beers or all grain beers that I have to boil for 60 minutes, I make a yeast starter. Now I don't use liquid yeast. In my neighborhood, liquid yeast is $10 to $12 a packet, and honestly, I'm not going to pay that for yeast. So I do use dry yeast, and most people say, oh, you don't make a yeast starter with the dry yeast because there are emulsifiers and molecules and chemicals that are supposed to help it, you know, just by sprinkling it on top. The only reason I do it is speed. I found by making a yeast starter, the fermentation starts faster and finishes faster than just rehydrating your yeast or just sprinkling your yeast on top. Alright, for instance, what I do, if I'm doing making a batch of beer that I have to boil for 60 minutes, since I don't have a wort chiller, what I do is I seal the bucket and I allow it to cool down overnight. Right, at least 24 hours, and then when it's room temperature, anywhere between 70 and 80 degrees, then I pitch the yeast. But before I seal the bucket for the night, I take about 3 cups of the actual wort that I just made. I cool it down in an ice bath in the sink, and then I pour my packet of yeast into that. And I use an Edemeyer flask and a small magnetic stir bar. After watching a video on YouTube, I made my own stir plate out of a plastic project box I got from Radio Shack, and an old computer fan. And the power supply comes from an old cell phone charger I found laying around in the junk drawer. So anyway, I take the wort, I cool it down to about 80 degrees. I pour it in the Edemeyer flask. Right? I put my magnetic stir bar in it. I put the yeast in it. I cover the top with some paper towels, right? Because we want it to breathe. When yeast wakes up and there's any oxygen available, well, then the yeast multiplies. If there's no oxygen available, then the yeast consumes the sugar and creates alcohol, I believe. If I'm wrong, right, please correct me down in the comments. But now that I've made this starter with the exact same wort that's in my bucket, I set that aside. And starters only have to run for, a day, 24 hours, which conveniently is about as long as it's going to take the, my main 5-gallon batch of the wort to cool down. Once everything is cool, the yeast cell count in the starter is like astronomical. I don't know offhand how many millions or billions of yeast cells are in a packet of the dry yeast that you buy. But after sitting in the yeast starter for 24 hours, there's a whole lot more. And then I just take the cover off my beer. I stir up any sediment that might be on the bottom, and there usually isn't because it's been stirred constantly. I pour the whole thing into the beer, and I've already had fermentation start in less than 2 hours. And that's fantastic because I've made many batches of beer where I just took the yeast and I sprinkled it on top, whether I stirred it or not, and nothing for 24 to 36 hours. Well, that's a little unnerving. You make the beer, you pitch the yeast, and you're staring at the airlock for 3 days and you don't see any activity. Then you start thinking, oh, I've got an infection, the yeast wasn't right, stuck fermentation. You start thinking about having to add a little more yeast. No, you make a yeast starter, and seriously, in like 2 hours, you can see the fermentation start. And since there are a lot more yeast cells, the fermentation doesn't last as long. I've already fermented a batch of beer in 5 days, making a starter, as opposed to 14 days just sprinkling it on top. Anyway, that's my tip for this week, guys. Alright, I hope your week this far has been good. I hope the rest of your week is even better. Alright, happy Homebrew Wednesdays, guys. Cheers 17, and if you drink beer, make your own. See you guys later.